There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a shared blanket. You don't recognize them as watershed events at the time. They are simply moments stitched into the fabric of your days. It's only later, when you look back, that you see the single, shimmering thread that changed the entire pattern. For me, that thread was pulled on a Tuesday, under the low light of a television screen, to the muffled soundtrack of a film neither of us was really watching. It was the moment Julian, who had built a fortress around his personal space, who claimed to be the least touchy person on the planet, shifted his weight on the old sofa, hooked an arm around my shoulders, and pulled me into his side as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and stayed there. To understand the seismic nature of that small gesture, you have to understand the architecture of our friendship. Julian and I were a study in contrasts, an accidental pairing that had somehow become a permanent fixture in each other's lives. We'd been assigned as senior year roommates in a crumbling campus apartment, a decision made by a housing algorithm that must have had a sense of humor. He was a whirlwind of social energy, a computer science major who spoke in confident, declarative sentences and seemed to collect friends like other people collected stamps. His side of the room was a controlled chaos of athletic gear, half-finished coding projects, and invitations to parties I would never attend. He moved through the world with an easy, unthinking grace, a bright star pulling others into his orbit. I, on the other hand, was a quiet satellite. A fine arts major with a focus in photography, I lived my life through a viewfinder, more comfortable observing than participating. My space was Spartan, my books stacked with geometric precision, my world ordered and calm. I found my language in shadow and light, in the things left unsaid between people. Julian had declared his philosophy on physical contact within the first week of us living together. He'd come back from soccer practice, sweaty and vibrant, and had clapped a mutual friend on the back with enough force to make him stumble. The friend, Mark, had thrown an arm around Julian's shoulders in a casual hug. Julian had stiffened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of discomfort in his eyes, and gently disengaged. Later that night, while he was making a protein shake that sounded like a jet engine, he'd said it, not to me directly, but to the room at large. I don't get it. I'm just not a touchy guy. Handshakes, a pat on the back, sure. But all that hugging stuff? It's not for me, he'd said it with a shrug, as if discussing a preference for a certain brand of coffee. It wasn't a trauma or a deep-seated issue, just a fact. A boundary line drawn clearly in the sand. And I, a lifelong student of boundaries, had noted it, filed it away, and made a silent vow never to cross it. Our friendship, therefore, was built on conversation, on shared humor, on a bedrock of mutual respect that never required physical reinforcement. We talked for hours, sprawled on opposite ends of the living room, about everything and nothing. He would try to explain the elegant logic of his code, and I would try to explain why a particular quality of late afternoon light made my chest ache. He would listen to my anxieties about my final portfolio, and I would listen to his frustrations with his senior thesis. He was the only person who never treated my art as a hobby, who saw the discipline and the work behind the images. And I was the only person, he once told me, who he didn't feel he had to perform for. With me, he could be quiet. He could be tired. He could just be. It was a strange and perfect symbiosis. I anchored his frantic energy, and he pulled me, gently, out of my own quiet solitude. Of course, there was a complication. A secret I held so close and so tightly that it felt like a second heart, beating a frantic, terrified rhythm inside my ribs. I was in love with him. It hadn't been a sudden lightning strike, but a slow, creeping dawn that I'd been powerless to stop. It started as admiration for his easy confidence, for the way he treated everyone with a baseline of kindness. It deepened when I saw the vulnerability he hid behind his bright smile, the flicker of loneliness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. It solidified into something unshakable one evening when he found me in a panic over a corrupted hard drive, my entire portfolio gone just weeks before the deadline. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply sat with me for 6 straight hours, patiently running recovery software, his calm presence a lighthouse in my storm of despair. When a single, precious folder of images reappeared on the screen, the look of relief on his face was as profound as my own. That was the night I knew I was in trouble. That was the night my quiet admiration became a quiet, hopeless ache. I became a master of concealment. My photography was my shield and my outlet. I had 1,000 pictures of him, none of which he knew existed. Candid shots, mostly. The way his brow furrowed in concentration when he was coding. The line of his shoulders as he stared out the window. A close-up of his hand, resting on a textbook, fingers long and capable. I told myself it was artistic study, an exploration of form and character. But I knew it was a form of worship, a way of holding on to him that would never betray my secret. I loved him from a safe distance, through the sterile mediation of a lens, convincing myself that our friendship was more than enough. It was precious and rare, and I would have sooner cut off my own hand than risk destroying it with the clumsy weight of my feelings. So I built my own fortress around that second heart, its walls high and its gates locked. Julian was my best friend. That was the foundation of our world, and I would not be the one to test its integrity. After graduation, our lives diverged in geography, but not in substance. He took a high-powered job as a software consultant that had him flying across the country 3 weeks out of every month. I found a small studio apartment in the city and scraped by doing freelance photography, portrait sessions, and the odd wedding. We lived in different worlds, yet he remained my one constant. He was the first person I called when I sold my first print, and I was the first person he called when a client presentation went spectacularly wrong in Omaha. We spoke almost every day, our calls a running commentary on our separate lives. He would describe the sterile loneliness of hotel rooms, the blandness of corporate meetings, and I would describe the smell of darkroom chemicals and the challenge of getting a 2-year-old to smile for a family portrait. Through it all, the unspoken rule held. Julian was still Julian. Confident, charming, and resolutely, emphatically, not touchy. He had girlfriends, of course. A series of them, smart, beautiful women who seemed, from my distant perspective, to be perfect for him. There was Chloe, the lawyer who matched his ambition, and then Maria, the graphic designer with a laugh that could fill a room. I was always polite, always friendly, playing the part of the supportive best friend. I listened to him talk about them, analyzed their compatibility, and offered measured advice. Each time, a small, selfish part of me felt a twinge of something ugly, a possessiveness I was deeply ashamed of, but the larger, better part of me just wanted him to be happy. His longest and most serious relationship was with a woman named Sarah. She was an architect, brilliant and kind, and for 3 years, everyone, including me, thought she was the one. They moved in together. They adopted a dog. Their Christmas cards looked like something out of a magazine. I saw him less during that time, our calls becoming less frequent as his life became more intertwined with hers. I understood. I accepted it, and I built my walls a little higher. The shift began with a phone call on a rainy Wednesday in October. It was Julian, his voice uncharacteristically small, stripped of all its usual bravado. The connection was staticky. He was at an airport somewhere in Texas. "She's leaving me," he said, without any preamble. The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. I could hear the tinny announcement of a final boarding call in the background. My own world seemed to grind to a halt. I was standing in my kitchen, a half-eaten apple in my hand, and all I could think was, this is impossible. They are a permanent structure. What? Julian, what happened? I don't know, he whispered, and the sound of his voice breaking sent a shard of ice through my chest. I came home a day early to surprise her, and she was packing. Said she's been unhappy for months. Months, Leo. Said I'm never really here. That I'm married to my job. That we're just roommates who share a bed. The last part was delivered with a raw, bitter edge. He was quoting her, and the words were poison. I spent the next hour on the phone with him, talking him down from a ledge of panic and self-recrimination. I didn't offer advice or platitudes. I just listened. I let him rage and stumble and fall silent, and I stayed on the line. a quiet presence thousands of miles away. By the time he landed back home, the apartment he had shared with Sarah was half empty. The dog was gone. The life he had so carefully constructed had been dismantled in the space of a single business trip. That was the catalyst. That was the hairline fracture in the foundation of his world through which everything else began to seep. He called me the next day. "Can I come over?" he asked, his voice rough. "I can't. I can't be here. In this empty place. It's too quiet, of course," I said immediately. My door is always open. When he arrived, he looked like a ghost. The usual light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow, bruised look. He was wearing the same clothes he'd flown home in, his suit jacket rumpled, his tie loosened. He didn't bring a bag. He just walked in, dropped his keys on my small entryway table, and sank onto my sofa as if his bones had turned to liquid. For the first hour, we didn't speak. I made him tea, which he held in his hands, but didn't drink. I put on some ambient music, soft and undemanding. I simply existed in the same space as him, letting my quiet presence be a buffer against the screaming silence of his own apartment. This became the new pattern. He'd finish his work for the day and drive straight to my place. He'd spend his evenings on my sofa, sometimes talking, sometimes just staring into space. I learned to read his moods, to know when he needed conversation and when he needed silence. I was his harbor, the one place he could retreat from the storm of his own life. The loneliness that had always been a faint, underlying note in his personality was now a palpable presence, a third person in the room with us. He was adrift, and I was his only anchor. And in his desperation for that anchor, the old rules began to bend. The ritual started subtly, as these things so often do. It began with movie nights. It was my idea, a way to fill the heavy silence that sometimes fell between us. A way to give him a distraction, a 2-hour reprieve from his own thoughts. We'd sit on my worn-out sofa, a bowl of popcorn between us, and lose ourselves in other people's stories. At first, he maintained his usual territory, a respectable cushion's width of space between us. He was a contained unit of grief on his side of the couch. But as the weeks wore on, the space began to shrink. One night, deep into a tense thriller, he was so engrossed that he didn't notice his leg was pressed against mine from knee to ankle. I, on the other hand, was aware of nothing else. The point of contact was a brand of searing heat, a focal point that pulled all my attention. I could feel the warmth through the denim of our jeans, the subtle shift of muscle as he moved. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I was terrified that if I moved, even a millimeter, the spell would break. So I sat perfectly still, my breathing shallow, every nerve ending alight. He never seemed to notice. When the movie ended, he simply stretched, yawned, and the contact was broken. He was oblivious. I was left vibrating with the aftershock. This became a regular occurrence. The incidental touch, a hand brushing mine as we both reached for the popcorn, his foot nudging mine under the coffee table. Each instance was small enough to be deniable, an accident of proximity. But for me, each one was a miniature explosion, sending ripples through the calm facade I worked so hard to maintain. I was living in a state of hyper-awareness, my senses fine-tuned to his every movement. I knew the exact rhythm of his breathing, the scent of his laundry detergent, the way a single lock of his dark hair fell across his forehead when he was tired. My quiet, observant nature, once a tool for my art, was now a source of exquisite torture. I was documenting the slow, unconscious erosion of his boundaries, and it was tearing me apart. The next escalation came about a month after the breakup. It was late, past midnight. We'd finished a movie, and he was staring at the blank screen, his expression bleak. "I should go," he said, but he made no move to get up. The words were heavy with a reluctance he couldn't hide. "You can stay, you know," I offered, my voice softer than I intended. "The couch is comfortable enough." I'd made the offer before, but he'd always politely declined, insisting he needed to go home to his own bed. Tonight was different. He looked at me, his eyes shadowed with a profound weariness. "It's not the bed, Leo. It's the silence, the emptiness. I lie there, and the room feels cavernous." I can't stand it." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure exhaustion. Would it be weird if I just crashed on your floor? Just to not be alone?" My heart did a painful lurch. "Don't be an idiot, Julian. I have a spare room. It's mostly full of camera gear, but the bed is clear. You can stay there." A wave of relief washed over his face, so potent it was almost visible. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. Stay as long as you need." So he stayed. That first night, I gave him a set of clean sheets and a towel and pointed him towards the small guest room at the end of the hall. I went to my own room, closed the door, and leaned against it, my eyes squeezed shut. He was here, sleeping just down the hall. The knowledge was both a comfort and a torment. My small apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, now felt charged with his presence. I could hear the faint sound of the shower running, the creak of the floorboards as he moved around. It was a strange and dangerous kind of domesticity, a fantasy I'd never allowed myself to entertain, now playing out in real time. I barely slept, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person breathing in my home. He started staying over a few nights a week. It became our routine. Work, my apartment, a movie, and then he would retreat to the guest room. He never brought more than a toothbrush and a change of clothes for the morning, as if to maintain the illusion that this was a temporary arrangement. But the ritual was cementing itself, becoming a new kind of normal for us. And with it, the physical boundaries continued to dissolve. He started to fall asleep during our movies. Not a gentle nodding off, but a complete, boneless collapse. The first time it happened, his head, which had been lolling against the back of the sofa, tipped sideways and landed squarely on my shoulder. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. His head was heavy, a warm, solid weight against my collarbone. I could feel the soft tickle of his hair against my neck, smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. My pulse was a frantic drum against my skin. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, pinned by the impossible weight of his trust and my own secret love. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I just let him sleep, my own body aching with the strain of my stillness. He slept for nearly an hour. When he finally stirred, he blinked, disoriented, and then seemed to realize where he was. He sat up abruptly, a flush creeping up his neck. "Oh man, sorry," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "I completely passed out. It's fine," I said, my voice tight. "You were exhausted." He didn't apologize again, but a new precedent had been set. From then on, it became a common occurrence. He would fall asleep on my shoulder, his guard completely down, his carefully constructed walls of personal space crumbling in his unconscious state. And I would let him. I would sit in the dim light of the television, my arm going numb, my heart a tangled mess of joy and pain, and I would allow myself these stolen moments of closeness. It was a dangerous game. I was the curator of his comfort, the silent guardian of his sleep, and with every passing night, the line between friend and something more blurred into an indistinguishable haze. I was living in the gray area, a place of profound intimacy with no name, and I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that it was not sustainable. Something had to give. And then came the Tuesday night that changed everything. It was a miserable, rainy evening, the kind that seeps into your bones. Julian had had a particularly brutal week at work, dealing with a difficult client and the looming threat of a project deadline. He arrived at my door looking utterly defeated, his shoulders slumped, dark circles under his eyes. He barely spoke, just dropped his bag and collapsed onto the sofa. I didn't press him for details. I just put on a quiet, visually beautiful nature documentary, something that required no emotional investment, and settled in beside him. For a long time, we watched in silence as images of deep oceans and vibrant coral reefs flickered across the screen. He was leaning his head back, eyes closed, just listening to the narrator's calm voice. The space between us on the couch felt both vast and infinitesimal. I was acutely aware of him, of the exhaustion radiating from him in waves. He seemed smaller than usual, his usual bright energy dimmed to a faint ember. My own heart ached in sympathy. I wanted, more than anything, to reach out, to smooth the worry from his brow, to offer some tangible comfort. But I was bound by the old rules, by the fear of misinterpretation. The documentary shifted to a segment on migrating whales, their massive, graceful forms gliding through the dark water. The score swelled and then fell away, leaving only the sound of the whales' haunting, melancholic songs and the gentle rush of the ocean. The room was quiet, filled with a sense of profound peace and immense scale. And in that quiet, Julian moved. It wasn't a slump of exhaustion or an unconscious lean. It was a deliberate, conscious act. He opened his eyes, turned his head to look at me for a fraction of a second, a glance so quick I might have imagined it. And then he shifted his entire body. He lifted his arm, draped it over my shoulders, and with a gentle but firm pressure, pulled me against his side. My breath caught in my throat. This was different. This wasn't him falling asleep on me. This was him, wide awake, initiating contact. My head was tucked into the space between his shoulder and his chest. My ear was pressed against the soft fabric of his sweater, and I could hear the slow, steady beat of his heart underneath. It was the most grounding sound in the world. His arm was a solid, warm weight around me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. He adjusted himself slightly, settling me more firmly against him. And then he let out a long, slow sigh, a sound of such profound release that it seemed to carry all the tension of the past few weeks with it. He said nothing. He just held me. My mind went into overdrive, a chaotic whirlwind of panic and disbelief. What did this mean? Was this a friendly gesture, a simple, platonic need for comfort? Or was it something else? The declaration he had made all those years ago, "I'm not a touchy guy," was echoing in my head, a stark contradiction to the reality of his arm wrapped around me. I was dissecting the gesture, analyzing the pressure of his hand, the angle of his body, searching for clues, for meaning, for anything that would help me make sense of this. I was so trapped in my own head that I almost missed the most important part. He stayed there. The documentary ended. The credits rolled. The screen went black. And he didn't move. He didn't let go. His breathing was deep and even, and for a moment I thought he might have fallen asleep. But then his thumb began to move, tracing a slow, absent-minded circle on my shoulder. A conscious touch, an intentional act. The small, repetitive motion was devastating. It was a quiet claim, a silent conversation I didn't know how to interpret. We sat there in the dark, in the silence, for what must have been 10, maybe 15 minutes. The only sounds were the rain against the window pane and the beating of our two hearts, one of which I could feel through his chest, the other hammering away inside my own. Every second was an eternity of hope and fear. Finally, his voice, when it came, was a low rumble against my ear. "Leo." I could barely find my own voice. "Yeah." There was a long pause. I could feel him gathering his thoughts. The small circle his thumb was tracing on my shoulder stopped. "Would it be okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "If I kissed you?" The world stopped. The rain, the refrigerator hum, the distant city traffic, it all faded away to a dull, distant roar. All that existed was his question, hanging in the space between us, fragile and terrifying and beautiful. It was the one question I had spent years dreaming of and years dreading. It was the key that could either unlock the door to everything I'd ever wanted or shatter the very foundation of my life. My mind, which had been racing moments before, went utterly, blessedly blank. All the analysis, all the fear, all the overthinking, it all just evaporated. It was replaced by a single, simple, overwhelming truth. Yes, I didn't say it out loud. I couldn't. Instead, I shifted, lifting my head from his chest and turning to face him. The darkness in the room was a gift, softening the edges of our fear, making us anonymous and brave. I could just make out the shape of his face, his eyes searching mine, his expression taut with a vulnerability I had never seen in him before. This was not the confident, easygoing Julian the rest of the world knew. This was someone else. Someone uncertain and hopeful and just as terrified as I was. In that moment, he wasn't the unknowing initiator anymore. He was achingly, breathtakingly aware. I closed the small distance between us and pressed my lips to his. It was not a passionate kiss, not the kind born of fire and demand. It was hesitant. It was tender. It was a question and an answer all in one. It was the taste of salt and rain and years of unspoken things. His lips were soft, uncertain at first, and then they responded, moving against mine with a gentle pressure that felt like coming home. His hand moved from my shoulder to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me there not with force, but with a kind of desperate reverence. My own hands, which had been clenched into fists at my sides, came up to rest on his chest, right over his heart, which was now beating as fast as my own. We broke apart slowly, reluctantly. Our foreheads rested against each other. His breathing was shaky, a mirror of my own. The silence that returned was different now. It wasn't empty or heavy. It was full. It was charged with the weight of what had just happened, a single, irreversible act that had redrawn the map of our entire world. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I was dizzy with it, with the sheer, terrifying relief of it all. "Okay," he whispered into the space between us. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement, a confirmation. "Okay," I whispered back. That night, for the first time, he didn't go to the guest room. He followed me to my room, and we climbed into my bed, the space that had for so long been my solitary island. We lay facing each other in the dark, the sheets cool against our skin. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, a simple, solid connection in the overwhelming darkness. We didn't talk. We didn't do anything more. We just lay there, holding hands, listening to each other breathe. For the first time in months, I felt him truly rest. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that the fortress around my heart might not have to stand forever. I fell asleep to the steady rhythm of his breathing, my hand held securely in his, and I dared to hope. The hope, I discovered, was a fragile, morning light thing. I woke up slowly, drifting into consciousness with a sense of warmth and contentment I hadn't felt in years. Julian's arm was draped over my waist, his body curved around mine, his breath warm on the back of my neck. We had shifted in the night, ending up tangled together like this, a position of such casual intimacy it made my heart ache. For a few blissful, hazy moments, I just lay there, soaking it in. This was real. Last night was real. Then he stirred behind me. His arm tensed, then retracted as if he'd touched a hot stove. He shifted away, creating a sudden, cold gap between our bodies. The loss of his warmth was immediate and jarring. I kept my eyes closed, pretending to be asleep, my entire body rigid with a sudden, sickening dread. I heard him sit up, the bed dipping with his weight. A long, heavy silence followed. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head, the panic building. Finally, I heard the whisper of fabric as he swung his legs off the bed. The floorboards creaked. I listened to his footsteps retreat, the soft click of the bedroom door closing behind him. He was gone. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, the ghost of his warmth still on my skin. The beautiful, hopeful feeling from moments before had curdled into a cold, hard knot of fear in my stomach. I had been a fool. I had misinterpreted everything. He had been lonely and grieving, and I had been a convenient source of comfort. The kiss, the closeness, it hadn't been about me. It had been about his own need, a momentary lapse in his carefully guarded defenses. And now, in the clear, unforgiving light of day, he regretted it. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting agony in my chest. When I finally forced myself out of bed, the apartment was silent. A single coffee mug, not mine, sat on the counter, rinsed clean and placed carefully in the drying rack. A note, scrawled on a napkin, was propped against the sugar bowl. Had to run. Client call. Talk later. No name. No affection. Just a sterile, corporate excuse. Talk later. It felt like a death sentence. I sank onto a kitchen chair, the napkin trembling in my hand. The quiet observer in me, the photographer who lived his life by watching and interpreting, had made a catastrophic error. I had zoomed in so close on what I wanted to see that I had missed the bigger picture. I had framed a moment of desperate loneliness as a portrait of love. And now, I was going to pay the price. The price was likely our friendship, the one thing I had treasured above all else. He didn't call. The day bled into a long, agonizing evening. My phone remained silent on the counter, a black mirror reflecting my own anxious face. Every time it lit up with a notification, an email, a news alert, my heart would leap into my throat, only to plummet back down. He was avoiding me. He was building his walls back up, higher and thicker than ever before, and I was on the outside. The silence was worse than an argument. It was an erasure. It was his way of pretending last night had never happened. The next day was the same, and the day after that. 3 days of deafening silence. The ritual was broken. He didn't show up at my door after work. The sofa felt cavernous and empty. The whole apartment, which had so recently felt alive with his presence, was now just a quiet, lonely space again. But it was worse than before, because now I knew what I was missing. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was haunted by the ghost of his laughter, the memory of his weight against my side. I felt raw, exposed. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus on my work. My camera sat untouched in its bag. How could I capture the truth in other people's lives when my own had just been built on a devastating lie? On the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The anxiety was eating me alive, the not knowing a far worse torture than any certain rejection. I had to do something. I had to break the silence, even if it meant forcing him to say the words that would destroy me. I needed to reclaim some small piece of myself, to stop being a passive observer of my own heartbreak. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over his name. My heart was pounding, a wild, panicked rhythm. I took a deep breath, squeezed my eyes shut, and hit the call button. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I was about to hang up, to retreat back into my cowardice, when he answered. "Hey." His voice was strained, distant. "Julian," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "We need to talk." A beat of silence. "I know. I'm sorry, Leo. This week has been insane." Another excuse. Another layer on the wall. "No," I said, cutting him off, my patience finally gone. "Don't do that. Don't hide behind work. I'm not one of your clients. I'm your friend." The word friend felt like ash in my mouth. Or I was. I don't even know what we are now. And I can't live in this silence. It's not fair. He was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, a ragged, unsteady sound. When he finally spoke, his voice was small, stripped of all its usual defenses. Can you come over?" The drive to his apartment, the one he had once shared with Sarah, was the longest drive of my life. The apartment was in a sleek, modern building that had always felt too impersonal for him. When he opened the door, he looked even worse than he had the week before. He was pale, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he was still in his work clothes from the day before, wrinkled and slept in. The apartment behind him was sterile and bare, half-empty boxes still stacked against one wall. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a waiting room. He didn't meet my eyes. He just stepped back to let me in, and then closed the door behind me, the sound echoing in the empty space. We stood in the entryway, a few feet apart, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. I decided I had to be the one to start. I had to be the one to turn on the light in this dark, confusing room. "I need you to be honest with me, Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "What was Tuesday night? And what is this?" I gestured to the space between us, the silence, the avoidance. "Because I am going out of my mind trying to understand it. I thought it meant something. But if I was wrong, you have to tell me. If I was just a convenient comfort, if you regret it, I need to hear you say it. It will hurt. But it won't hurt as much as this." He finally looked at me, and his expression was one of pure, unadulterated misery. His eyes were swimming with a confusion and fear that mirrored my own. "You weren't wrong," he whispered, his voice cracking. "That's what's messing me up so badly. You weren't wrong." He sank down onto one of the moving boxes, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. "I don't know what's happening to me, Leo. All my life, I've had this roadmap. You go to school, you get a good job, you meet a nice girl, you get married. That's the plan. That's who I'm supposed to be." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "And then Sarah left, and the whole map just burst into flames. I was lost, and the only place that felt safe, the only person who felt like home, was you. He stood up and started pacing, running his hands through his hair in that familiar gesture of distress. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't analyzing it. I was just surviving. And surviving meant being near you. Your apartment was the only place I could breathe. And that night, on the couch, it wasn't about being lonely. It was about being lonely for you. When you weren't there. When you were in your own room, down the hall, it felt too far away. All I wanted was to close that distance. He stopped pacing and faced me. When I kissed you, it was the first thing that's felt real and right in months. It was like a compass needle finding north. I wasn't confused. Not in that moment. Then why? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why did you run away? Because the next morning I woke up, and I was me again, he said, his voice full of self-loathing. The guy with the roadmap. The guy who isn't touchy. The guy who dates women. And I panicked. Because what I felt for you, what I feel for you, it's not on the map. There's no landmark for it. It terrifies me, Leo. It terrifies me because it feels more real than anything else, and I have no idea what to do with it. So I did what I always do. I ran. I hid in my work. I tried to pretend it didn't happen, that I could just put things back in their neat little boxes. But it's not working. All I can think about is you. He finally stood still, his chest heaving, his confession hanging in the air between us. He had laid all his fear and confusion at my feet. The unknowing initiator had finally been forced to know himself, and the knowledge had broken him open. My own anger, my own hurt, it all just melted away, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't cruel. He was just a man who had been taught to follow a map, now finding himself in a beautiful, terrifying new country with no guide. I closed the distance between us, slowly, giving him time to retreat. He didn't. I stopped in front of him and reached out, my hand hovering for a second before I gently cupped his jaw. He leaned into my touch, his eyes closing, a shudder running through his body. Julian, I said softly, you don't need a map. I paused, letting the words sink in. You just need a compass. His eyes opened, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just looked at me, his gaze full of a raw, dawning hope. What if you're my north? He whispered. And that was it. That was everything. All the walls, all the fear, all the confusion, it all crumbled to dust with those 5 words. I leaned in and kissed him again, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was a kiss of acceptance, of homecoming. It was a promise that we would figure out this new country together, one step at a time. It was the beginning of a new map, one we would draw ourselves. We started over. Not our friendship, but everything that came after the first kiss. The days that followed were tentative, like the first days of spring after a long, hard winter. There was a fragility to our interactions, a carefulness, as we learned this new language between us. We talked for hours, not about coding or photography, but about us. We unspooled years of unspoken feelings, of misinterpreted signals, of fears we'd both held. I told him about my secret photographs, and he didn't flinch. He just nodded, a soft, sad smile on his face. I think, he said, a part of me always knew. I just didn't know that I knew. He confessed that his frantic social life was often a shield against a deep-seated loneliness, and that my quiet presence had always been the only thing that could truly soothe it. The physical intimacy returned, but this time it was different. It was intentional. There were no more accidental touches, no more ambiguous cuddling born of plausible deniability. When he reached for my hand now, as we walked down the street, it was a clear and deliberate statement. When he pulled me against his side on the sofa, it was an invitation, not a subconscious act of need. Every touch was grounded in the honesty we had fought so hard to find. It was quieter, in a way, but infinitely more profound. The desperate, anxious energy was gone, replaced by a calm, steady certainty. He slowly moved out of his sterile apartment. It happened piece by piece, not with a moving truck, but with a gradual accumulation of his life within mine. A box of books appeared on my shelf. His favorite coffee mug became a permanent resident in my cupboard. His suit jacket was a fixture on the hook by my door. My small, solitary sanctuary was slowly, beautifully, becoming our home. We never had a formal conversation about him moving in. It just happened. It was the most natural thing in the world. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I found him in my kitchen, wearing an old t-shirt of mine, calmly making breakfast as if he'd been doing it every day for years. The morning light streamed through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a scene of such simple, profound domesticity that it almost brought me to tears. I leaned against the doorframe, just watching him, my camera-trained eye absorbing every detail. The way he hummed softly to himself, the concentration on his face as he flipped a pancake, the comfortable, easy way he occupied the space. He looked up and saw me, and a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. It was a smile I'd never seen before, one completely free of performance or defense. It was just for me. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and soft. "Morning," I replied, walking over to him. I wrapped my arms around his waist from behind, resting my chin on his shoulder. He leaned back against me, covering my hands with his own. We stood like that for a long moment, watching the pancakes sizzle on the griddle, perfectly in sync, two separate people who had finally found the same rhythm. The guest room at the end of the hall was slowly reclaimed by my photography equipment. My bed, which had once felt too big for one person, now sometimes felt a little too small for two, in the best possible way. The door to my bedroom was closed at night now, not to shut anyone out, but to keep us both safely inside, together. I finally understood that home isn't a place with four walls and a roof. It's a feeling of safety. It's the quiet understanding that you can be your whole, unedited self and still be loved. It's the profound peace of knowing that no matter how chaotic the world gets, there is one person who will always be your anchor, your harbor, your true north. We had found that in each other, not by following a map, but by getting hopelessly, wonderfully lost. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the unspoken certainty of a love that had finally found its voice.